And welcome to this edition of IIEA Insights with me, Dan O'Brien. The European security environment has been transformed since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine almost 4 years ago, and the pace of events has accelerated recently. Last week, the Russian president said he was prepared for war with Europe, and just today, Russian media is talking about the opening of not one but two new fronts. All of this was brought home to us in Ireland last week when it emerged that sophisticated drones were operating just off the coast of Dublin in the flight path of the Ukrainian president's plane around the time he was flying in. To discuss the state of play across the continent, we're joined by the defense editor of The Economist, Shashank Joshi. Thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very pleased to be here.
So to start, Shashank, what do you think about the rhetoric of the Russian president last week? Is it merely rhetoric, or do you see the probability of an expansion of war beyond Russia, beyond Ukraine, anytime soon?
So I think it is mostly rhetoric. Of course, a defense requires being aware of the possibilities of how a war could spread, particularly in the medium and longer term. But in the short term, I think it's always very important when we hear these sort of lurid, very elaborate, vivid threats from the Russian leadership, whether that's Putin or members of his regime. They're always conditional. They are always conditional. They always say, if Russia is attacked, we may respond by sending nuclear weapons across to the UK or to Europe. If Russia is attacked, then we will strike back at Europe. They are conditional statements. And I think what's happening here is that Russia, and I'm speculating, of course, but I think Russia is responding to the heightened period of diplomacy that we're in, and in particular to the concern around European military deployment inside Ukraine, which is, of course, one of the really sort of issues around which Russia is really neuralgic. And so what they are trying to do is elevate the perceived risk of any such deployment, trying to heighten European perceptions that this would result in or be directly resulting in a conflict with Russia, and a conflict in which Russia would be willing to fight and die and lose troops, in contrast with Europeans. And the Russian leadership, of course, knows that most European populations are wary of the idea of any direct confrontation with Russia. They're happy to support Ukraine. We know that from the polls, but they are wary of losing lives in a direct clash with Russia, particularly for the sake of a non-NATO member in the form of Ukraine. And I think what that does is Russia is using this rhetoric to heighten perceptions of risk and deter any sort of force inside Ukraine. I don't think it prefigures any kind of conventional aggression against Europe in the short term at all.
Okay, good. Well, it's reassuring. In terms of the hybrid warfare, or so-called, and obviously there's big questions around whether Russia has been involved and how involved and coordinated it is, what the purpose of it is, whether there's a broader strategy to it. What is your sense on Russia's use of hybrid warfare in Europe?
Well, I mean, hybrid, of course, as you know, Dan, is such an all-encompassing term that includes all these provocations short of full-scale warfare. And of course, the Soviets had a term for this. It was called active measures, and it was a practice that was part of the Russian, I guess you could say, playbook since the Bolshevik Revolution, and in some ways before, even with the Tsarist secret police made use of active measures to entrap their opponents. And this includes everything from disinformation, propaganda, all the way up to assassination, sabotage, violent activity. And in case, we were in any doubt of this, we can get onto drones in a minute, of course, which is a subject of great interest. But the bit I look to is actually not the drones. It is the most violent, edged element of this, which is the railway disruption in Poland, which is extraordinary. This is critical national infrastructure being physically damaged in ways that could have real world consequences in loss of life. And this isn't just a Ukraine phenomenon, a post-Ukraine phenomenon. We know that the GRU, specifically Unit 29155 of the GRU, which is best known for attempting to kill Sergei Skripal in the English city of Salisbury in 2018, also blew up ammunition dumps in Bulgaria well prior to the invasion of Ukraine. And so it's that kind of activity that I see as the most dangerous, because it would be fairly easy for Russia to inadvertently cross the line from what it sees as hybrid into something that could cross the threshold of NATO's Article 5. And don't forget, NATO as an alliance has said publicly and reaffirmed that an accumulation of actions that individually would be below the threshold of Article 5 could cumulatively push it over the edge. And I think in the last year or so, when you look at cable cutting, you look at drone incursions, you look at railway sabotage, you look at assassination, including assassination threats against the CEO of European defense companies like Rheinmetall, I think you have a very dangerous situation in which Russia may not know precisely where those NATO lines are. But of course, the Kremlin will be, I think, emboldened by the knowledge that the American administration is keen to avoid a confrontation, and they can exploit the resulting lack of consensus inside the alliance to push further and further and further. And perhaps that it brings us on to these drone incursions that we've been seeing that if you like, we can also address.
We'll come to that. You raised the Polish rail attack. From what I read, it seems that if that had actually turned out in the worst possible way, there could have been very significant loss of life.
Yeah.
Do you think loss of life will be required to bring NATO over that threshold and start talking about Article 5?
Well, I think that's the easiest route. I don't think it's the only route. Of course, as you know, Dan, Article 5 is it requires an armed attack. But an armed attack is whatever the North Atlantic Council, the political executive body of NATO, chooses to make it. In 2001, it was by no means obvious that terrorists flying a plane or multiple planes into buildings would constitute an armed attack in the sense that that term is used in the corpus of international law and international affairs. But it was decided as such for political reasons and very valid political reasons by NATO in 2001. And so the loss of life, I think, would be the most obvious route by which a country could declare an armed attack and persuade others that that has occurred. But I wouldn't rule out other quite dangerous scenarios, including large-scale sabotage, for example, of ammunition depots or warehouses, but also of things like nationally threatening cyber attacks. You know, we've just had a cyber attack in the UK against Jaguar Land Rover that has caused more than £2 billion worth of damage and has been shown in the GDP figures. Those kind of attacks on a larger scale, I think, could easily persuade countries that they face something equivalent to an armed attack in its effect and consequence. And I think part of the challenge of these hybrid activities is that you're always struggling to calibrate the right line. You don't want to sort of allow the initiative to be ceded to Russia, nor do you want to overreact to any individual incident in a way that would result in the Russians getting the crisis that they seek. And I think walking that line has been exceptionally hard for Europeans, particularly when their principal ally is looking so mercurial and capricious at this time.
Yeah. That's one way of putting it. Just on Ukraine, events are moving apace. The talks in London yesterday. If there were to be a ceasefire, do you think that would calm the wider security situation in Europe, or do you think it would lead to Russia shifting its posture and being more focused on other European countries?
Well, Russia's on the front foot, and we must acknowledge Ukraine's battlefield weaknesses. And the result of that is that any settlement that occurs, and I don't think one is on the horizon, but any one that occurs is going to be advantageous to Russia. It will reflect Russian terms to a considerable extent, and that will be helped by the fact that this administration appears to be desperate for a deal, partly for reasons of sort of presidential vainglory around Nobel Peace Prizes, and the result will be that I think Ukraine will be very vulnerable in the aftermath of a settlement. Now, Russia has to be somewhat careful. It can't withdraw all of its forces from Ukraine because Ukraine is perfectly liable to break the ceasefire and take back a lot of Russian territory currently held. Russia can't just abandon Ukraine, but the size of its forces in the country at present mean it could quite easily divert 200, 300, 400,000 troops, coming up on 500,000 forces, to the Moscow and Leningrad military districts, which border Finland and border NATO, where it has already been building up infrastructure, barracks, facilities in the last couple of years. And it's important for me to say here, even now, before a ceasefire, people may not know this, but Russia is not consuming all of its annual or monthly missile and shell production. It is sending some of those to storage facilities and building up a stockpile of missiles, of shells, and it may be the case of particularly advanced armored vehicles, especially T-90Ms, the most advanced Russian tank in the arsenal, some of which are being refurbished. And so what we are going to see, I think, is a fairly rapid reconstitution of Russia's hardware capability facing NATO in the period after a settlement. And we're beginning to see elements of that even now. Now, I want to put that in context because it doesn't mean Russia will have a force that is capable of of providing an existential threat to Europe. The Russian army will be big, but it will be relatively weak in training and skill. It will not have the capacity to conduct complex combined arms maneuver operations in the same way that it can't do so now in Donetsk on the Eastern Front in Ukraine. But it would pose a serious challenge to any European military commanders looking at that correlation of forces. And I think that the degree to which Russia is able to divert its forces and focus on NATO after a ceasefire will directly depend on the strength of security guarantees for Ukraine and how strong those are. And the weaker they are, for example, the sort of, the weaker the European presence inside Ukraine, the weaker the arms pipeline to Ukraine in the aftermath of this, the more Russia will be liberated to focus on the Eastern Front. But I still think we are talking of a timeline measured in years, not a timeline measured in months.
Okay, so just interesting at that point that you say that they're not consuming everything they're producing. So clearly, there's a very significant industrial capacity in Russia to manufacture weaponry, and that's not going to go away.
Well, hugely significant. I mean, I haven't got the statistics at my fingertips, but I think we've heard the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte talk about Russian production to make 3 million shells per year by the end of this year, which is a total that exceeds European production at this point. Now, are the shells of the same quality? Probably not, but they are have been benefited enormously by receiving North Korean supplies, which they have been able to use on the battlefield, thereby reserving more of their own production for themselves. Similarly, we are seeing Russian Shahed production, Shahed missile production, and Iskander missile production jump significantly. Europe is well behind. We know this. Europe, has been very, very slow to rebuild the defense industrial capacity it needs to keep up. And while some of those changes are occurring, in my country, in the UK, we've seen ammunition factories announced in the last couple of months. In Germany, Rheinmetall is making massive strides in shell production. Ultimately, we are still behind the Russian side, and the rearmament curve, the pace at which they can rebuild their stockpiles versus the pace at which we in Europe can rebuild ours, is still at this point advantageous to Russia. And of course, well, into that we have to factor the risk that American suppliers will be delayed, limited, constrained as the Americans prioritize their own conflicts. And we've just had a national security strategy that clearly says Europe is a low priority, the Western Hemisphere and Asia are much higher priorities. And that will also make a difference to our ability, for example, to acquire air defense munitions.
In terms of Ukraine's capacity, for those of us who aren't military experts, it's sometimes said that the cities close to the front that the Russians haven't taken are strategically important, both in terms of geography and also important in terms of their industrial capacity. Could you give us sort of an expert view on how important those cities are?
Of course, I mean, so what you'll have noticed is that the battle in recent times has been over a town called Pokrovsk, and Pokrovsk, which is in Donetsk Oblast, is tiny. Its pre-war population, I think, Dan, was about 60,000. I remember looking down the list of British cities to find one that was 60,000, and you had to get pretty far down the list to find somewhere anyone would recognize, 60,000. So in terms of its mass, its resources, its population, its size, it's insignificant. But it does matter a little bit because what it does is it forces Ukraine to push its defensive line further west. That changes the terrain that Ukraine has to fight on, and it forces Ukraine to rebuild its defenses. So, for example, this is a conflict in which entrenchments, trenches, fortifications, pillboxes, these are all very important things. And Ukraine has to rebuild and reconstruct those every time it's forced further west. I think the other thing is, of course, symbolically, as you move further west into Donetsk, being able to capture all of Donetsk would effectively complete Russia's capture of the Donbass region as a whole. And then that would remove one of the bargaining chips that Ukraine has, which is currently in the peace proposals. Currently, the Americans are pushing Ukraine to hand over the rest of Donetsk, which of course is very unpalatable for Ukraine and indeed for Europe. But once Russia occupies that, if indeed it does occupy it, that would take that away as a bargaining chip for Ukraine. So there's a kind of diplomatic function to this as well.
You mentioned the new U.S. security strategy already. It is an absolutely extraordinary document, and I recommend it's only 30 or 32 pages long. I certainly recommend people read it. It really is very stark to see to see how different things are and how differently this administration views the world, even compared to the first Donald Trump term.
Yes.
What are your sort of impressions of that document, Shashank?
Well, you're absolutely right to say it's a radical document. I think a few things. First of all, it's a codification of the American view that the unipolar moment, that the moment of American dominance in the 2000s is well and truly over. That America will no longer attempt to act as if it is the sole superpower. It recognizes that's no longer the case, and it will therefore pull back from many of its commitments. It will focus ruthlessly on the Western Hemisphere, and the document talks about the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And of course, as most of your listeners will be aware, the Monroe Doctrine was the view set out in America's much earlier in American history that the America would exclude competing powers from the Western Hemisphere. In that case, of course, principally France, Spain, and Britain. And so that's part of it. The other part of it is a framing of how America thinks about competition with China. And what it does, I think, is say America favors the status quo in Taiwan. So it doesn't abandon Taiwan, but it does effectively frame competition with China in terms of trade and economics rather than security, defense, and national security. And I think you saw incredible evidence of that just yesterday when the Trump administration said, Dan, it would agree to allow Nvidia to sell one of its most advanced chips to China in exchange for a percentage of the profits from the sale. And for many China hawks in the United States, including, I must stress, those who worked in the first Trump administration, not just Democrats, not just Biden China hawks, this is a moment at which Trump is effectively abandoning a core element of tech competition with China and accepting the idea China may achieve AI dominance through its control, its access to these advanced chips. And the national security strategy basically sort of hints at some of this. But the final, most incredible aspect of this strategy, I think, is the incredible hostility and contempt it contains for Europe as a whole, which it portrays as a continent that I think the phrase is engaging is at risk of civilizational erasure. And the document mimics the tropes, the language, the ideas of many of Europe's far right parties, the AfD in Germany, the RN in France, the Reform Party here in the UK. And what it says is that the rise of these far right parties, that many of us probably view as deeply unsettling and dislocating to our politics, is to be welcomed, is a great thing for Europe. And that ultimately Europe is a repressive place where free speech is stifled, where democracy is trampled underfoot, where censorship is commonplace. And jumps out at me here in all this, Dan, and I'll stop after this, is just to say that you get the impression this administration views Europe, and particularly what you might call the incumbents of Europe, as a much bigger threat to American interests than Russia. And there is
Yeah,
nowhere in the document that spells out Russia as a threat or even as a competitor. It just says we need strategic stability with Russia. And I think that is a really alarming moment. We don't know, of course, how much this will, shape policy directly. It's written by Michael Anton, who was a State Department official who's left the administration. It bears the hallmarks of Stephen Miller, who is a kind of very a deeply ideological figure in the NSC on immigration, particularly. There's people like Marco Rubio still around who are much more orthodox national security Republicans. But I think it sends a very alarming signal about the basic fundamentals of Trump thinking on this subject.
what does it say about U.S. commitment to NATO's Article 5?
Well, this is to some degree theological. We can't know for sure. But I think if you were reading this, you would come to the conclusion that um, if America does not really care about Europe, if it sees Europe as a fat, lazy, feckless continent, but even worse, not just a continent that is not engaged in burden sharing, which I suspect is a diagnosis that actually many of us even might agree with and have some sympathy for, but actively sees this as a repressive continent that is worse than Russia, why would you send American lives why would you risk American lives, blood and treasure, for the defense of any of that territory when you see these people as hostile to your interests? When you see these people as, Russia is a continent to do business with, but Europeans are censoring your tech companies. The EU is requiring fines from your companies. And we saw this from Christopher Landau, who's the Deputy Secretary of State, who America sent to NATO ministerial meetings last week. And he came out saying, look, what I've come to realize is that while NATO is meant to be this alliance, the EU, most of whom are also NATO members, are actively attacking us and undermining our interests. So, to me, what I take away is that the probability you would put on this presidency abiding by Article 5 should be discounted heavily. And I'm not going to say it's zero, but I will say it should be discounted by a significant factor. And no minister in Europe can responsibly say that, of course, because it would encourage Russia and it would undermine deterrence. But as analysts, I think it is our obligation to be frank and honest about this and say that we have to be honest and say the odds are not what they were in terms of the US coming to Europe's aid in a crisis.
And with that, let's turn to Europe and what Europe is doing for itself. In terms of how things have changed, European defence capabilities over the past 4 years, how do you assess how much has changed? Clearly, budgets have risen, but with inflation, maybe not as much as they look at first glance. But in terms of additional capabilities, how close is Europe to sort of closing gaps? Where have gaps not been closed? Give us some expert sense of the capability picture now.
Look, I think money's quite good. Money's doing quite well, and particularly in Germany, where the infusion of money is hugely significant. I think the problem is France and Germany are still well behind, and in the UK, France and Britain are still far behind, and in the UK, which of course for many years was the largest spender in defence spender in Europe, above France and Germany. We have agreed and signed up to this target of 3.5% of GDP on defence. But most of that money does not appear until the 2030s. It doesn't really start appearing at all until 2027. This year and next year will be belt tightening years, which in some ways is extraordinary given the situation that we're in Europe. And in Europe, look, it's great that Estonia is spending 5%. It's great that the Nordics are spending more. But let's be absolutely honest, in terms of the aggregate size of economies, it really, really matters what France, Germany, and Britain do when it comes to raw capability, just by dint of size of GDP. And the picture there is great for Germany. But by the end of this decade, and this is just blows my mind sometimes, Germany could be spending twice as much on conventional military forces as the UK, which is just this incredible historical shift. Takes us back to the 70s and 80s, where the Bundeswehr was a really serious military force in Europe. And of course, for the UK, a good chunk of our budget is allocated to nuclear weapons, which is, I believe, important to the defence of Europe, but it is not a capability that directly buys you on the ground or in the air combat capability. Now, to directly come at your question, Dan, where are we on capability? I think we're doing a pretty good job on beginning to fill munition stockpiles, which had fallen dangerously low. I think we are beginning to think hard about the air defence problem, in which we had massive gaps, and that is where the biggest gap exists between NATO plans and NATO capability. I think the figure in NATO planning circles is that you would need a 400% uplift in air defence systems to meet NATO targets. And when the capability planners announced that target in the room of NATO planners, I'm told by someone who was in the room that there was an audible gasp because they were so shocked by the scale of this discrepancy. But of course, when it comes to filling in key capabilities on which we presently depend on America, that is the bit that worries me most, because those are niche, expensive, reliant projects. They are intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So that is spy planes, reconnaissance planes, spy satellites. It is logistics. Transport aircraft, refueling tankers are absolutely vital in sustaining operations across Europe. And finally, it is something that is much less tangible in terms of capability, but is very, very important, which is staff, commanding officers who can fill high level posts like NATO Land Command, which is a four-star US general, NATO Air Command, a US four-star general, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, a US four-star general, and so many of these other staff positions throughout the alliance, in which only a small number of countries, UK, France, Germany, maybe the Finns, the Poles, have experience of planning and conducting operations above the level of brigade in divisions, armies, and corps, and in which you would need more European talent, training, and capability. That stuff takes years and years to build. You do not get a spy satellite in 3 years. It's the work of 5 to 10 years, and that is precisely where I think we are still very, very slow to respond.
How significant do you think the European Commission's Security Action for Europe fund of 150 billion will be for addressing some of those problems, not the staff issues, but the hard sort of capabilities you mentioned there?
I think very useful. I think they will give countries with less fiscal headroom the ability to put more money on defense without having to worry about some of the budgetary constraints they would have had to worry about previously. But also, we know for a fact there is too much duplication in military equipment in Europe. And schemes like SAFE will, if they go well, begin to tackle that problem. They will begin to encourage investment in European supply chains that will be more reliable in a crisis. And the idea is that, of course, if you're reliant on outside supplies of, to give you one example, rocket motors. You are extremely vulnerable if you need to ramp up air defense interceptor production in a conflict. But rocket motor production is a huge problem for Europe right now. There are nowhere near enough companies building solid rocket motors in ways that you need to take out low to mid-level threats like a Russian Shahed drone. So to encourage that on a European level, schemes like SAFE, I think, are absolutely essential. Now, of course, the problem is, we've seen Canada join SAFE, but we all know, as we've seen the last couple of weeks, the UK has not been able to agree a deal with the EU on SAFE. That seems to be over the level of contribution required to join the SAFE scheme, and I think that that's quite problematic, given the importance of UK defence industry, including to many EU partners. And I'm thinking here of countries like Sweden, countries like Germany, where you have very significant cross-border ties. And I think that that could pose a real problem down the line when you're sort of trying to knit these defence industries closer together. But it's not an easy issue for the UK either, of course, given how closely we are intertwined with US defence industry for so many critical capabilities.
And do you see any prospect of UK and the EU agreeing something in the future, or has that been closed for the medium term?
No, I think it's still possible, but I think here is where the politics can be quite difficult because you have a UK government that is, drowning electorally, politically, watching, a hard right party come racing, past it on over its shoulder, and not only is it discussing quite technocratic proposals like SAFE, there's also talk of whether the UK should be getting closer to the customs union in ways that would be, obviously extremely politically sensitive, given the public prominence attached to trade deals with India and the United States, which would not be compatible with joining the EU customs union, obviously. And so the dilemma for the government, for what is relatively a weak and unpopular government, is on the one hand, it needs to do this to shore up the economy. On the other hand, does this give sort of pour fuel on the flames of the problem that is the Reform Party, a hard right Eurosceptic party that will exploit these feelers to the EU ruthlessly for its own ends, and that will come back to punish the government, particularly in ahead of local elections next May, which effectively could be make or break for this prime minister, for Keir Starmer. That could end his premiership. And so I think the politics of saying we should work more closely with the EU, even though the geopolitical imperative is quite obvious, I think the politics is extremely difficult right now.
And just looking ahead, very speculatively, it's probably a long time in the future. But if there were to be a reform-led government, how do you think it would affect defence, UK's defence, security, and defence posture?
Well, I think that would be a really radical rupture with a lot of what we've known. Um, as your listeners, some of them will be aware, the Reform Party has a pretty checkered history on dealings with Russia. It's one of its leaders I think in Wales, was recently convicted of taking money from the Russian state for friendly statements in the European Parliament. And Nigel Farage, I think, very famously said, effectively he said he avoided blaming Russia for the Skripal poisoning back in 2018. He's made a number of pro-Russian comments since then. Now, not everyone in the Reform Party is off that view, and I think even Nigel Farage realizes that an overtly pro-Russian approach does not play well in the UK. It's not what the UK population seeks or wants, and they respond very badly to it. But I think what you would see is a sense that we need to cool tensions with Russia. We don't really need to be sending money to Ukraine for its defense. We need to deal with Russia. Who cares about territory in Ukraine? We need to stabilize things. They would be of a position that is much more akin to that articulated in the national security strategy. But I think that it would undercut support for NATO, and it would undercut support for other pan-European initiatives on defense. And I think that the government would be very wary of signing up to a 3.5% pledge on defence, and they would absolutely not feel the need to move to it with anywhere near as much speed. But I think, to be absolutely frank with you, Dan, it's very hazardous attempting to guess what this would mean, other than a radical change, other than a rethink. I don't think Reform themselves have deeply thought, coherent views on this subject, and I certainly don't think it would result in, a withdrawal from NATO or a kind of total breakdown of all our basic assumptions, because I think there is still this imperative in Reform to understand where the electorate are at, and you could well be looking at coalition governments anyway that would have a restraining factor on all of this. But here I stress I'm very much talking above my pay grade as a defense analyst.
Sure, appreciate that. Anything, two issues, if you've heard anything in relation to Ireland. You saw last week there was a drone
Yeah.
incident just off the coast of Dublin. Have you heard anything about that? And more widely, clearly there's some resentment in the UK about the degree which the UK provides security around Ireland, over Ireland, given the different, let's say, fiscal positions that Ireland has. Luckily, plenty of money at the moment, and the UK is in a more difficult position. Are you hearing sort of growing rumblings or any sort of resentments, pressures around that issue?
So, first of all, on drones, I mean, this is obviously a very, very concerning incident, and I haven't been able to independently corroborate all the reported facts. But what I have seen, which is what you'll have seen, is very troubling in terms of what it indicates about the level of professionalism that was on display in this incident, in which large, substantial drones were able to fly into an area that was on the flight path of Zelensky's plane. And I think the important thing is, this is not an isolated incident at all. We have seen on the same week an incident in off over the French nuclear submarine base, the Ile de Long, in which not just drones were detected, but the French gendarmerie were also shot at those drones, which I think is quite remarkable, because to shoot at these drones and potentially put civil aviation at risk or have them fall on populated areas is very, very unusual for these incidents. It hasn't happened in others. About a month ago, we saw additional drone incidents over the Baltic region, and there is suspicion from the security sources I talked to, but I stress no more than that, no hard evidence, that some of those drones may have been operated offshore from Russian Shadow Fleet vessels, and one of those vessels was detained off the coast of Brest by France. I, in my conversations with officials, no one has been able to say to me, "We know this is Russia," but there is a widespread sense that although a number of these drone sightings may be mass hysteria, because once you report one, other people tend to see drones when they look up. A number of these may be hysterical sightings. a kernel of them are not. And there is a suspicion that absolutely this is Russia at work, very possibly acting in the way that it has done in these other hybrid operations, not through hardened intelligence officers smuggled into NATO or EU countries, but by criminal proxies paid in cryptocurrency to act as middlemen to conduct harassment and low-level diversionary attacks in ways that try to portray Europe as defenseless, weak, and at the mercy of Russia in ways that sap our public collective will to stand up and respond to Russia. And my suspicion would be that the case we saw in Ireland was exactly of that kind. It fits with that description. And what it shows to me is we need, of course, better technical capabilities for drone detection, for drone interception. These are not expensive capabilities when it comes to small drones. You can buy them. The problem is that blanket coverage is expensive to cover every single site because there is only local coverage from the radar, from the interceptors. They're not things that cover 100 miles at a time. So you need lots of them at different sites. But more than that, Dan, I think we need a language, a vocabulary to talk to the public about this that says, we're not sure what this is. We suspect this is Russia. We can't prove it. We don't know for sure, but we're not going to be ashamed about declaring our suspicion publicly, even though we may get it wrong from time to time. And I think in the past, states have been so wary of getting the attribution wrong on the
Right.
basis of limited evidence, they've held back. And I think we now have to be more comfortable by saying we have to be comfortable in a low confidence environment when it comes to attribution. To say we may get this wrong, we'll be honest about it when we do, and we'll acknowledge that when we do, but we are going to warn you, the public, that we think this campaign is going on. And I think that in the UK, Ken McCullum, the head of MI5, gives an annual threat assessment. He gave his last one a few months ago, and it was pretty frank on all of this. But I think we need to see this much more commonly across Europe. The Germans have got much better at it in a way that is very unprecedented. If you look at statements by the heads of the BFV and the BND, their domestic and foreign intelligence agencies, the Dutch are very good at it. I think we need to see much more of this in other European countries in sensitizing the public to these problems. Now, on the second point about the mood in Whitehall, look, I don't think this is a major issue. Actually, I don't think there's a lot of grumbling or grievance about this. In part because the cost associated with some of these airspace operations, these maritime operations, is not huge. It's not massive. So it's not as if it's a fiscal drain that is causing huge amounts of resentment. Um, but I will say that I think as we see so many of these, particularly undersea threats, get worse and worse. And here I encourage everyone to listen to the remarks by Gwyn Jenkins, who is the head of the Royal Navy, the first Sea Lord, at a conference just a few days ago. He could not have been more clear about the level of concern he has about Russian undersea activity. And this is an area where detection is very hard. Attribution is very hard. And where the Russian state has massive resources in terms of its undersea capabilities through what we call GUGI, which is a specialized branch of the Russian Defense Ministry that deals in underwater reconnaissance and sabotage. And it is precisely the cables around the British Isles and in British and Irish waters that I think are a source of really serious common concern. And I think that you cannot defend these without a concerted joint effort. And here I think the thing to remember as well from the Irish perspective is that I think there is a huge advantage to countries that may not traditionally have massive military capabilities, but
Uh,
may have advanced technical capability, undersea capabilities to use those capabilities in building out undersea networks in ways that could be extremely useful for detection of these things.
so there's a view often put here, and I think it's plausible that disrupting the cables would be an act the US would clearly find damaging to U.S. interests, given the transatlantic nature of the connections, the importance for U.S. companies. So there's a view that it's not so much the cables that could be at risk. There's another view that says Russia might want to show its power projection over to this side of the continent, and it could have an incentive to cut the gas link between Britain and Ireland as a way of demonstrating that capacity, but without affecting U.S. interests. How plausible do you think the latter argument is?
Yeah, I think that what that gets at very astutely is the sense that these Russian actions are calibrated in ways that make responding more difficult and are often targeted, sending a very particular signal. So, for example, many of the early drone incidents were addressed directly at Denmark, which has been the state that is most forward-leaning in its support for Ukraine. But I think it would be exactly what you would expect of Russia, not to conduct an all-out offensive in a crisis to sever everything in a way that could immediately and obviously trigger Article 5, but to do so in selective ways that would complicate the response. And I think you're absolutely right that avoiding transatlantic cables and focusing on European infrastructure, whether that is a UK Ireland gas link, or indeed whether that's a North Sea pipelines, North Sea cables in ways that connect the UK to these countries, or for example cables connecting European islands like Svalbard in the Arctic, a Norwegian island which has a Russian presence on it and is governed by a Norwegian-Russian treaty. Those kind of statements are more likely to be able to send a message of Russian strength and dominance without necessarily dragging the Americans straight in. And I think those are exactly where you need to be watching very, very carefully. And of course, the other thing here to remember is that Russia would also look for seams between NATO and the EU. So again, targeting EU states that are not part of NATO, which is decreasing number of those states, of course, with the accession of Sweden and Finland, would be another way of complicating any ensuing discussion in the North Atlantic Council and exploiting the fact that within the EU, crisis response is a much less well-developed muscle than it is in NATO.
A final one, Shashank, in terms of China. There was a report last week that the balance of power between Ukraine and Russia has shifted back to Russia thanks to fiber optic cable the Chinese are giving the Russians, which allows them to avoid Ukrainian jamming mechanisms. More generally, how important is China for Russia in defense terms?
China is the single most important enabler of Russia's defense industry, bar none. And without it, Russia's defense industry would grind to a halt. And that remains the case even though there is no direct provision of significant lethal arms of any kind, apart from maybe some UAVs. You're absolutely right to note fiber optic cable, and that isn't, this comes back to our point about European rearmament, which is it's often the strangest things on which defense capacity hinges. It turns out that with the ubiquity of jamming on the battlefield, if you pilot your drones using a fiber optic cable, a tethered cable, you can be immune from jamming. And the Russians have been quicker at pioneering these kind of drones, which in some ways, to me, by the way, hark back to the old, Soviet anti-tank missiles of the 70s, the old Saga missiles that were used against Israel in the Yom Kippur War of 73. And the quality of fiber optic cables is higher on the Russian side. They've been able to outbid the Ukrainians. They've been able to secure Chinese supply. And the Ukrainian supply, from what I understand, is also of a lower quality. And so it tends to break more easily once the fiber optic cable is unspooling. And that advantage in drones is really profound. And I'll give you one example of this. On parts of the front in Ukraine, casualties among Ukrainian drone operators and logisticians in the rear are higher than casualties at the front. Because what Russia does with a unit called Rubicon is use these drones to attack the Ukrainian rear areas, knowing that if you attack those areas, you isolate the front and prevent resupply and can then pick them off more easily. And so this has been a really, really serious challenge for Ukraine. And after years in which Ukraine had the drone advantage, yes, it has now flipped to Russia. And that is one reason why we are seeing Russia have the initiative on the battlefield today.
Again, apologies to those who put questions, but I think the extraordinary range of the answers and the detail there was very much worth getting over the full 45 minutes. So, look, thank you so much for giving us your time. Thanks again to you and to our viewers today. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks for having me, Dan.